Hi, friends. Welcome to the Generation Cedar Premium podcast. I'm so glad you subscribed because this is where you get the really good stuff, the meaty stuff. So grab a cup of coffee or just do whatever it is you love to do, and let's dive in. Welcome to today's podcast, The Secret to Homeschooling Without Stress, a look at school versus education. I am so excited about this particular episode because it's one of my passions, and I love talking about it. I have spoken about it here and there. I love writing about it. I love sharing with friends. And so we are just going to dive right in. And I think that you are going to really have a completely different perspective. And this might even be a life changing episode. So let's dive in. There is a very specific reason why you and I feel stressed out about homeschooling. And I'm about to tell you exactly what it is. But first, I need you to think about some things. Do you remember the almost unbelievable fact about Galileo from when you studied about him in high school? Maybe you've read to your children about him. He is a man we now admire for his incredible contributions to science as an astronomer. But did you know that he was questioned by the Roman Inquisition of the Church, publicly threatened to be tortured, and finally convicted of heresy and placed under house arrest until he died, all for saying that the sun was the center of the solar system? Something so obvious to us now, but it would be 116 years after Galileo's death before society laid down their stubborn prejudices and accepted what he knew and had tried to prove for so long. There's another man I want you to know about. You may recognize it. His name is Ignaz Semmelweis. I probably just butchered his name. He's Hungarian. He was a doctor in the mid 1840s. He worked in the maternity ward, and he noticed that the death rate for new mothers was significantly higher in the ward staffed by doctors than the ward staffed by midwives. So, after some experimenting and research, he found the difference in the two. The doctors were performing autopsies and going directly to deliver babies without washing their hands. He had them start washing their hands and the tools, and the death rate drastically dropped. He found an answer that was actually saving lives. Do you think the medical community gave him an award and rejoiced about this? No, he was banned from practicing medicine, and they returned to the practice of not washing their hands. This man had discovered germs before the microscope. They didn't want to believe what they thought was his kooky idea, that there could be something invisible causing the deaths, because they were smarter men than that. It threatened what they believed. I know you're wondering what Galileo and Semmelweis have to do with being stressed out about homeschooling. Here it is. I have some things to share with you that will remove so much of your stress in homeschooling. Some of the things I share today will free you up and bring joy to your homeschooling journey. It will giving your children a fantastic education. There's just one catch. Some of these ideas about education are pretty radical to contemporary methods. So you're going to have to allow yourself to consider the possibility that something we've thought about one way for a long time may at least not be the only way. There was actually a metaphor named after Semmelweis known as the Semmelweis reflex or the Semmelweis effect, which is the reflex-like tendency to reject new evidence or knowledge because it contradicts established norms, beliefs, or paradigms. Challenging the status quo of a long-standing idea like Galileo and Semmelweis did, like I'm going to do today, is hard, but it's very important. Well, I quit homeschooling about 3 years ago. What I mean is, I finally realized after 19 years, the reason I was so stressed about homeschooling because I was home schooling. To say it differently, we're stressed out about homeschooling because we're so focused on the schooling our children instead of educating them. And see, a lot of us think those are the same thing. Most of us are probably first generation homeschoolers, and we took what we think to be the essence of education and brought it home and started schooling at home. And I say with John Taylor Gatto, who is a retired veteran school teacher, he has passed away, but he has some great resources online. I strongly recommend you look him up, get encouraged with, get uh, familiar with his stuff. He said, school and education are not the same thing. They're not even distantly related. Before homeschooling, I taught high school English. And most people think teaching school is an advantage to homeschooling. I believe the opposite is true because I was so strongly conditioned to do school that I really didn't have a grasp at all of a real education. So I'm 22 years into this thing and I feel like I'm just beginning to grasp what a real education is. We've all been strongly conditioned about what education is supposed to look like. It's the only narrative we know. As a teacher, I got caught up in filling in the blanks, checking off the boxes, turning in my neat little papers because I like boxes. I like checking things off and I like neat rows of stuff. There are a lot of you out there I know who have color coded charts hanging on your fridge at home. The school system also likes those neat, organized things because it's easy. It's easy to enforce and it's easy to measure and it's easy to take up time with, especially with a lot of children in one classroom. I liked the classroom. It was symmetrical and uniform. The problem is our children are not symmetrical and uniform or easy to measure. I thought the classroom was set up for learning, but school is set up the way it is because of a lot of wrong reasons. For one, schooling is about measuring outcomes, and the only way to measure things is by testing. And testing can't really measure understanding. It can't measure wisdom. It can't measure character. It can't measure skill or creativity or so many other forms of intelligence or things that encompass an education. It can only measure facts and things students memorize, and also things students forget. Testing measures only a sliver of what makes a person educated. But the methods of the classroom are driven largely by a methodology of testing. And why does schooling want to measure outcome? Because they want to create a certain outcome. There's a reason it's called standardized tests. The problem is our children aren't standard by any means, but schooling is a system by which they are encouraged to be standard, really forced to be as close to everyone else as possible. They do that on purpose, by the way. The educational system is after a product, and those who don't measure up on the tests aren't viewed as just different or having different strengths. They are automatically disqualified from the game and labeled because they deviate from the standard. And I believe this is one of the greatest tragedies and has hurt so many children. Most of you may know the story behind how mass compulsory schooling came to be, and so you can understand that education isn't the motive. If you don't know, I recommend John Taylor Gatto's book, The Underground History of Education. It will blow you away. Now, there's a reason I'm talking about the classroom and the way it operates, because you're thinking, how does this concern me? I homeschool. I'm talking about school because we have brought school home too much. We've brought the methods of the classroom home and called it homeschooling. But most of us really follow the schooling that we came out of. And so this connection is really important to make. So I'm in the classroom teaching diagramming sentences one day, and most of my students hated it and they didn't understand it. And as a teacher, I just got angry. Why? Because the textbook said to diagram sentences and they would be tested on whether they knew how to place an adjective clause. And if the textbook says they need to learn it, then if they don't learn it, they won't be educated. That was my thought process. Besides that, I really loved diagramming sentences, so I didn't get it. But guess what? Most people who learn to communicate well, even those who make a living communicating, Do so whether they have ever diagrammed a sentence or not. The whole point, or what should be the point, is learning to use language well. That's the educating part. Now, we're told that diagramming sentences is going to help us do that. And I began to realize it right there in the classroom 19, 20 years ago, although I understand it so much better now. I needed to get my mind off tests and performance and honestly fear and start caring about real education. I needed to figure out and care about what they needed to learn, what they wanted to learn, and how they learn. What I learned there was the beginning of this fabulous journey of understanding the difference between schooling and education. And that has made a radical, wonderful difference in our home educating. So the process started when I began thinking about the things we were teaching. Okay, diagramming sentences, we'll go back to that for an example. When a student asked me to explain why we diagrammed sentences, I spouted off a scholarly answer about how the more we understand parts of speech, the better communicators we become. And that sounds like a reasonable explanation, right? But I had taken so many courses of advanced grammar in college, and I knew deep down that diagramming sentences wasn't at the heart of learning to communicate well. See, language is a breathing, living thing. We begin learning it as soon as we're born. Did you buy a formal curriculum for your babies? I didn't. I don't know of anybody who has. And learning a language is complicated and very important. So that's not something we can afford to fail at. But I don't think I've ever seen a mom stress about whether her kids will learn to speak under normal circumstances. But they learned it, little children. And not just that, they learned grammar. You didn't have to explain that if they wanted to make a plural word, they needed to add an S. Did you know they teach that in school, even though every single student has known that since he was 3? You didn't have to teach him how to conjugate verbs. He started very early and he figured it out after some cute mistakes. But we go over and over how to conjugate verbs, even though we inherently already know it. Why do they teach it then? Because measuring the definitions of a simple rule of grammar is much easier than measuring its proper use. So they make us memorize rules about things we already know how to do. See? So it really helps us to understand that testing these measurable definitions drives much of the way schooling works. Now, fast forward to my life now as a homeschool mom, and we have done very little formal grammar. I mean, very little. And I love grammar. I think learning to communicate well is probably the most important part of a good education. But grammar is only a means to an end, it's just a tool. Better communication is the goal. We learn to communicate well by reading, by copying words, by hearing words, and by actually exercising the art of communication. Albert Einstein said, "There's no real learning apart from experience. The only real learning happens by doing." And if I were to ask you if you could explain what a predicate adjective is, there may be a few who could, but do you know what a subjunctive mood of a verb is or a gerund? These are all common terms. And I'm sure you have no problem using those terms, but you might struggle to define them. And that's because communication is a basic part of our existence. We learn it well, we don't have to analyze it, we don't have to memorize all the syntax. A fabulous chef doesn't become fabulous by studying the molecules of the food. He becomes fabulous by using the food and experimenting with the flavors. Understand something. You don't have to throw out your grammar book if you're not ready to make that kind of leap. But you don't have to be enslaved to it either, thinking that if you don't do it, your kids aren't going to learn what they need to learn. Moms come to me a lot describing a scene of wailing and gnashing of teeth because Susie can't get past diagramming sentences. Mom's crying, Susie's crying, everybody hates homeschooling. No, 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 no. It doesn't need to be like that. Throw it out. She's going to be fine. And I don't think that's teaching your child to give up. There are plenty of areas in life where we can teach tenacity and discipline without making learning miserable for them. I don't think we need to sacrifice the joy of homeschooling on the altar of teaching diligence. There are other ways to do that. So I said we had done very little formal grammar. My kids all write well. Several of them write really well, and get this, they correct grammar every time they hear something wrong or see something. They know correct grammar usage, and that's what we're after. Now, some of you are probably wondering, okay, I agree, but what about what they need to know those terms for college entrance exams or what have you? Don't we have to jump through the hoops just to make sure they're prepared? The short answer is no, you don't. A couple of other answers. Ironically, after all that memorization of terms in school, most college entrance exams will test grammar by usage. So it won't say, identify the part of speech this word is. Instead, it will have an underlined passage, and you have to say whether that's correct or if it needs replaced with the correct option. Secondly, taking a crash course, you can even take them online, before a test is very helpful, especially when you already have a grasp of the subject itself. So it's not as if our children can't take tests unless we put them through 5 years of grammar. You see what I'm saying? We can focus our time on more meaningful learning. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. By the way, I have a daughter who has gone to college and did really well. She made straight A's in nursing school. She had never taken a formal test before. She passed her ACT, was able to make A's in all of her classes. And that to me was really when this method of learning sealed the deal for me, because I saw that she was able to learn what she needed to learn when she needed to learn it. She was dedicated and focused and determined, and that made all the difference. If you have a visual learner, he may love diagramming sentences. Let him. I'm not trying to say diagramming sentences is bad, but that we need to understand it's not necessary to reach our educational goals. If it is hindering the joy of your journey, close the book. And that's one big part of what will free you up as a homeschool parent. So I just spent a lot of time talking about one little aspect because I want to force you to think about this. What is your goal as a homeschooling parent? That answer should determine how you educate. We grew up in a classroom where a teacher told us what to learn, when to learn it, how to learn it. And there are some inherent flaws with that. And in order for us to capitalize on our freedoms as homeschoolers and raise truly educated children fit for whatever God has for them, we need to overturn much of our thinking about how children learn. And this is hard. We need to overturn our thinking that the classroom model is ideal for learning because, as I've already mentioned, even though we removed our kids from the traditional classroom, we dragged a whole bunch of the classroom home with us. So here are some fundamental things I want you to consider as we distinguish between the difference in schooling and education. Number one, God gave children the capacity to learn what they need to learn when they need to learn it. Don't you love that? When I hear a mom thinking about homeschooling, say she's afraid she can't do it, she doesn't even realize she's already been homeschooling for 5 years. Not only that, but giving her children the very best grounds for learning, freedom to discover and explore. I say she's been homeschooling. The truth is, she's been letting her children learn, and they're doing great. 86% of a person's brain growth takes place in his first 5 years. In a relaxed, natural environment without any forced schooling, with just an engaging mother who loves him, a toddler receives a tremendous education. An education almost entirely from his own exploration. God did that. He created us that way, and we trust it until they're 5. We say, okay, now it's time for him to learn something. If he could rationalize what we were really saying, he'd probably say, are you kidding me? Did you just see what I learned for the last 5 years? So we'll pluck him out of real life, plop him into a desk, hand him over to the experts, or if he's homeschooled, we'll look to see how the experts are doing it and we'll copy that. And while there is plenty of schooling that I think can be good, much of it I think has squelched the desire for learning God put within them, and often we do more harm than good. We need to return to trusting the amazing ability a person has to learn what he needs to learn anytime in life. It is, in fact, nothing short of a miracle that the modern methods of instruction have not yet entirely strangled the holy curiosity of inquiry, for this delicate little plant, aside from stimulation, stands mainly in need of freedom. Without this, it goes to rack and ruin without fail. That is a quote by Albert Einstein. The second thing we need to remember, we must define education. I think we don't ask ourselves enough, what is education? A basic dictionary from the 1828 Webster Dictionary, a basic definition goes like this: the formation of a whole person, the character, manners, the bringing up as of a child. Education encompasses the whole life. It is not something that starts and stops. It is not something we have to finish or we fall behind. It is constant from birth to death. Based on that definition of education, that is the formation of a whole person, character, manners, I submit there are 6 things that underpin how we approach education. Number 1, there is no real knowledge apart from the fear of the Lord. That's what Scripture tells us. We must begin there, not treating the Bible as one of our subjects, but letting God's Word encompass all subjects. Number 2, our focus needs to be on letting them learn how to learn. I just talked about that. They're built for that. Perhaps we could say continuing to let them learn. And if we succeed in that, they will be able to jump through whatever hoops are necessary in the case they need to go to college or whatever their path is. We have this idea that a child can only learn what we or someone teaches him. That's false. We have small children sitting in desks, filling out pages of worksheets about opposites, colors, telling time, and a myriad of concepts that they could learn easily on their own in a much more natural setting if given the chance. Now, the worksheets may not be harmful, but they do, in my opinion, tend to separate us from real life where everything we need to know already exists. And this forcing of learning, studies show, does squelch our natural desire and curiosity. When we separate information from real experience, the brain just doesn't retain it well. And you know that from what little you remember from your own school experience. The third thing to consider about education, children are different. We don't need to put them in a box. Many of you may homeschool because you already know this, but I've recently really only come to grasp how very true this is and how much it affects our home education. We have this idea of this huge checklist of things children must know. I've had so many people, when they find out we homeschool, ask, well, how will you teach them chemistry? What if I don't teach them chemistry? Better yet, what if they learn chemistry only if they need it? And I'm always tempted to quiz them right there and see how much chemistry they know. We learn as much chemistry in real life as we need. If you have a scientist on your hands, believe me, he'll learn chemistry. And at the time he needs to study advanced chemistry, there will be no lack of methods and resources. You aren't going to hinder him. The truth is, there isn't a huge one-size-fits-all checklist. There's a man named Sir Ken Robinson, and he has an excellent TED Talk on how schools kill creativity. If you haven't seen it, you should look it up. It's worth it. But he talks about this travesty of cramming every child into a box and expecting him to learn the same things the same way, all while crushing his creativity and the unique things God has given him. But how many of us have built our model of homeschooling on the same idea? There are a few basic things all children need to learn, and after that, each one may go in a completely different direction. Here's something else Albert Einstein said, and just really listen and think about this for a minute. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And guys, there's so many kids out there that this is their reality. I've seen it over and over. If you're good at math, you're smart. If you're not, well, too bad for you. Again, as a homeschooler, remember that so that you don't feel enslaved to this method that isn't necessary and that I think is actually harmful. Now, hear me, I'm not saying that formal curriculum is bad. Don't message me with hate letters, but feeling enslaved to curriculum is bad. If it works for you and your children, perfect. If it doesn't, there are other ways. The fourth thing to remember about education is playing. Playing is an important part of education, and don't start schooling too early. Homeschoolers have a particular temptation to want to school very early because of the pressures to perform and prove to our suspicious friends and families that homeschooling is better. But more and more studies are showing that formal academics can actually hinder a child's development. What younger children need plenty of is play. I hate to keep quoting Albert Einstein, but he had some really great things to say. He also said, play is the highest form of research. Play is the highest form of research. When they're playing, they're not just playing. Important development is happening. A man named Fred Donaldson said, children learn as they play. More importantly, in play, children learn how to learn. And isn't that our goal? Finland boasts of some of the best educated children in the world. One of the things they do differently is they have a later mandatory age for school at the age of 7, and they place a lot of emphasis on playing as important to brain development. And they also have shorter instruction times and more free time. Whether it's time spent outside, using their imagination, pretending, building, or creating, they are learning to solve problems. They're developing important thinking skills that will be foundational to all their learning. Don't underestimate that. The fifth thing we must remember is we must challenge the status quo of what we think needs to be taught. We have a culture of testing that is inhibiting the development of life skills. Only about 6% of all jobs are STEM jobs, science, tech, engineering, math, careers, yet we focus so much time and energy on the classes that are only really needed for those professions, treating them as essential when in fact they're not. I mentioned at the beginning that I couldn't find a good enough reason to teach sentence diagramming. As I've thought and written about education over the past few years, I just constantly challenge myself to question the status quo. Someone said, don't memorize something that you can look up. And that was before the internet. Another education reformer that I like to read, Roger Schenck, he said, we really have to get over the idea that some stuff is just worth knowing even if you never do anything with it. Human memories happily erase stuff that has no purpose. So why try to fill up children's heads with such stuff? Concentrate on figuring out why someone would ever want to know something before you teach it, and teach the reason in a way that can be believed at the same time. I love that quote. We have so little time in the big scheme of things. There is more to learn than we'll ever learn. So it's my opinion that we need to scrutinize everything and weed out things that aren't useful to us. And guess what? Those things may be very different for each person. The sixth thing to remember about education, refuse to be led by college fear. One thing that has gotten in our way of understanding what a real education is the fear of not getting a, quote, good job, which involves, everybody knows, going to college. Thankfully, this idea is starting to crumble a little bit. I'm really glad to see that. They're starting the skill, trades, creativity, those kind of things are starting to gain more traction, but we still have a ways to go. But what has to happen to get into college? Good grades, good test scores. And those things become our whole aim. And then we become driven by fear. Now, college isn't inherently bad. College is very needful for some professions, those STEM careers specifically. But most people do not need to go to college, especially in the world we live in now. College needs to be put in its proper place. It's an expensive, time consuming institution, mandatory for a few professions, but we have elevated it as this status symbol. It's what smart kids do. We think companies will only hire the college grads, but that is rapidly changing. Matt Walsh wrote this about college. Many times, that kid who's being choked to death by formal education will eventually get suckered into going to college. He'll go not because he needs to be there, nor because it's the best thing for him, but just because. No other reason. So he'll amass a giant debt, miss out on 4 or 5 years that could be spent honing his specific skill set, and end up exactly where he could have been and would have been without college, only now he's $28,000 in the hole and half a decade behind the curve. Something has to change. This can't continue. It is not a sustainable model. There are millions of kids with no assets, no plans, and no purpose, taking out enormous loans to purchase a piece of paper they'll likely never use. It can't go on this way. End quote. Whew. We've let college become such an idol, the icon of achievement and success, that it rules the educational process and I believe cripples true learning and limits our children. It will take a while for the masses to stop idolizing the college degree, but I think it is happening slowly, and employers are beginning to become privy to the reality that kids are coming to the workforce with a piece of paper and nothing else. No experience, no motivation, no problem solving skills, poor communication, and they'll hire this kid over here with some of those traits over the piece of paper any day. I've seen it happen. And while many of your children will work for someone, I'm hopeful we're going to see a surge in entrepreneurs as we begin to encourage our children to follow their passions and free them up to hone their gifts and their skills. We need to encourage our children to start businesses, to be leaders, and there's never been more opportunity for that than now. And if you still feel driven by fear, to make sure you jump through all the hoops so they can pass the test, etc. Even though you want to embrace this freer idea of education, relax. When a child has a good foundation with all the things we've discussed here, they have a good sense of communication. They know how to find answers. They know how to solve problems. Getting into college will not be any trouble for them. If it's relevant and they have a good reason for it, they will find a way. Now, bringing these separate concepts together and fleshing it out to talk about what a more comprehensive education might look like, here's another quote by Gatto. In centuries past, the time of a child or adolescent would be occupied in real work, real charity, real adventure, and the real search for mentors who might teach what he or she really wanted to learn. A great deal of time was spent in community pursuits, practicing affection, meeting and studying every level of the community, learning how to make a home, and dozens of other tasks necessary to becoming a whole man or woman. John Mark Reynolds, who is a professor of philosophy at Biola University, summarizes a good education in which a child can read well, write well, be numerate, and cultured. And so, based on Gatto's philosophy of education, I've summarized what he explains are the basics of a well rounded, real education. Because what are we doing here? To educate is to prepare our children for adult life, not to fill them with trivia or waste their time forcing them to study things they won't remember. So, here are 10, I'll say 11. Let's go with 11 basics of a well rounded education. They're really short. Number one, an understanding of human nature. Don't miss that. It's so important. Also called emotional intelligence. Very, very important. Number two, good communication, writing, speaking, and understanding. Number three, the formation and practice of good manners and politeness. Guys, this is a dying one, and it will set your kids apart in the workforce. Teach good manners and politeness and courtesy. Number four, independent study and work. Number five, a complete theory of access to any place and any person. Where to find information when you need it. Who can I go to ask? Number six, just responsibility. This is normally easily taught through chores and expectations in the home, but it's so important. Number seven, development of character. Number eight, familiarity with the fine arts. Number nine, the power of accurate observation and recording. 10, the ability to deal with challenges. And lastly, the development of good judgment. And I would also add specifically the importance of wisdom in finances, because that has such a major impact on how we live, even how much money we need to make. We do Dave Ramsey for that. Dave Ramsey's homeschool for high school curriculum. And boy, if we can impart these things to our children and none of them are found in a textbook, we will put them so far ahead. Now, what does that look like fleshed out? It's difficult using this freer philosophy of education to say specifically how it's done. And I know a lot of homeschool moms just tell me what to do, tell me exactly what to do. And that's part of the hurdle we have to get over. School taught us to believe that education looks the same for everyone when in fact it doesn't. So, what my family does and what my children spend time on may look different than yours. I would suggest sitting down with your husband and the two of you really talking specifically about the things you want for your children as you give them a whole education. Now, I'm going to give an overview of our list of our educational goals. It's not an exhaustive list, but it may be a good starting place for you to think through as your family discovers what's best for you. So, our overview of what we really want to impart is a biblical worldview. We want our kids to be able to give an answer for what they believe. We want them to be problem solvers, self learners, and thinkers. We want them to have upright character. I don't have to tell you what a missing ingredient this is in our society. If we could just accomplish raising children of character, so many problems would be solved. We read a lot and we encourage lots of reading. Most of my kids do not enjoy reading, if I'm being honest. So I do a read aloud in the morning, every morning with everyone. And then a large part of what their formal schooling looks like is reading what we call real living books. Now, in order to encourage that, I would strongly suggest putting strict limits during the day on technology because they're always probably going to default to that. So a little boredom goes a long way. We also recognize that sitting down at a desk for long periods is not natural, especially for boys. So the more hands-on learning we can do, the better. Experience is a better teacher. We encourage conversation and questions. We encourage them to create, imagine, build, and produce. Again, I will say it, boredom is a great catalyst. If your kids aren't bored, they're likely not going to gravitate to being creative. So do your children a favor and help them be bored periodically. We utilize instructional videos and documentaries. That's really good, especially for visual learners. But goodness, there are so many great resources online now that it's just a really helpful tool for the homeschooler. We encourage them to conduct small businesses related to their gifts. I have a son who's an artist who has sold his art. I had a daughter open an Etsy shop when she enjoyed crocheting. What are the others? We've had several different. One of my children started a bath bomb business. It's really easy to start a bath bomb I'm sorry, to start a business. She started hers right before Christmas because people are looking to buy things, and so just encourage your kids with that. We encourage apprenticeship, learning by experience from others who are experts in their field. We try to inspire them through museums, concerts, magazines. Bait your house with good books and magazines. That's always just a little trick that might get them interested. Have interesting people over. Expose them to other hobbies. There are a lot of different ways you can do this. Play good music, read good literature, allow them to tinker with whatever interests they have. Teach them how to use tools they need to find information. When I had I ended up with 4 girls that became very good in gymnastics, but my 2 older ones, they became interested in gymnastics. And, we live in the country. We don't have a lot of access to people and places, so they found some YouTube videos and they started practicing the exercises. And we eventually got them gymnastics lessons. And the first day that they went in, the coach came to me and she said, who was their coach before here?" And I said, "Well, this is their first lesson." And her mouth almost dropped to the floor. She couldn't believe how skilled they were, but it was just from, the free resources that we had. Teach them how to find information to help them with what they want to do. So, an education for us has slowly morphed into something bigger and I think better. Equipping children in this way prepares them for whatever they will do for a living, but it also prepares them for life outside of that living. So, I hope I've encouraged you to see what incredible possibilities we have as homeschoolers. Relax, Mama. Enjoy this journey and marvel at what God has put into the minds and hearts of your children. Then trust Him and trust them and stand back and watch them soar. And if you want more details about how we practice a relaxed method of homeschooling, I have a book on my website at generationcedar.com. It's called Think Outside the Classroom. It's a practical approach to relaxed homeschooling. So I hope you've been encouraged and inspired. I'd love to hear from you. Do you have questions or comments? Leave them for me and I'll try to answer them. Thanks so much.